and the diverse strands of the Philippine left, and their interaction not only in Philippine politics, but with the sort of transnational connections between communist parties across the world, including in neighboring Indonesia. The thesis is so rich that he has spun out of it a series of recent journal articles and one book, already moving ahead to a second book, but he has a book that should be coming out over the next year or so with Cornell University Press, titled Aligned Rivalries, the Sino-Soviet Split from the Periphery. And there's so much to his work that's really tremendously eye-opening and interesting for scholars of the Philippines, of Southeast Asia, and also of Cold War history and the history of communism in the 20th century. So it's a real pleasure to have him with us, and I look forward to his talk. Welcome, Joseph. You can go ahead.
Thanks very much, John, for that warm introduction, and thank you to the Soswi-Hawk Southeast Asia Center for hosting this event, as well as for hosting me as a visiting fellow. Just one moment while I set up screen sharing. Okay. So everyone should now see my slides. John, you can unmute and tell me if that's not the case. So my talk today is called The Sino-Soviet Split from the Periphery, the Philippines as Case Study. And what I'm going to be dealing with is examining why it was that in April 1967, the Philippine Communist Party split in two, and why it split along the fault lines of the Sino-Soviet dispute, with one of the parties, which I will be referring to as the PKP, Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas, aligning itself with the political line of Moscow, and the other party, which was founded in 1969 from elements expelled from the PKP, which I'll be referring to as the CPP, the Communist Party of the Philippines, aligned itself with the political orientation and program of Beijing. And bound up with this question, inescapably, is the question of dictatorship. Ferdinand Marcos imposed martial law on the Philippines in 1972. And the two parties, as I will lay out in my talk, were integral to this development. And this really is the heart of my scholarship, the role of these communist parties in the imposition of dictatorship, and the motives, the mechanisms underpinning their split. This, as John mentioned, comes out of my work as a scholar at UC Berkeley, my doctoral dissertation, which was entitled Crisis of Revolutionary Leadership, Martial Law and the Communist Parties of the Philippines. And building on that, I now have a forthcoming book, as well as a book that is currently under review. The forthcoming book with Cornell University Press is called The Drama of Dictatorship, Martial Law and the Communist Parties of the Philippines. And the book, whose substance I will be outlining today, is entitled Aligned Rivalries, the Sino-Soviet Split from the Periphery. The forthcoming book, Drama of Dictatorship, deals with the mechanisms, the machinations in exceptional detail, whereby Ferdinand Marcos imposed martial law in September 1972. It was in some ways a grueling account, a harrowing account to write. You know what's coming as you work through the material of the archive, of the newspapers, and so on. And you write and you rewrite your way through the dissertation and then the book. And every time I wrote myself to September 1972, there was a sense of dread. You knew what was coming. It felt ineluctable. It didn't have to be. There were alternatives. There was an immense social ferment from 1969 to 1972. And I wrote in the conclusion to my book, this was a sentence from the conclusion of my book: "Shades of the present haunt every work of history, but in few instances is their presence as palpable as this one. The drama is being restaged." And the stuff of history is in some way or other always alive, but seldom is that so true as it is in the Philippines now. We once again witnessed the rising tide of global authoritarianism as there was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, so too now. And this is playing out in the Philippines. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is a front runner for president. His vice presidential candidate, Sara Duterte, daughter of the current president, is also front runner for vice president. And they, both of them, bear not only in their family name and lineage, but in their program and orientation and their platform, and their very bearing, the threat of dictatorship. So these are not merely the stuff of history. They are the stuff of their life and death stuff of the present. And that's evident in the response to my work, which has received a great deal of interest and a great deal of outcry. It has been cited on the front page of the Manila Times, among other places. It has been manipulated and falsified to present my argument as somehow a justification for dictatorship, which it is not. I base myself on a number of sources. I read through the newspaper record from 1959 to 1974. The newspaper record largely disappears in 1972 because when Ferdinand Marcos imposed martial law in September, he shut down the press. But there reemerged a controlled press that I did read through as well. Any historian or scholar who has used the newspaper record knows how much effort goes into reading the daily paper over the course of years. You discover a great deal that's been left out of the history books, but you also wind up with a sense for the complexity of the past. I've coupled my study of the newspaper record with declassified government documents, and above all, a wonderful collection housed at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, called the Radical Papers Archive. The Radical Papers Archive is 43 boxes of material that had been housed in the basement of Diliman. It has subsequently been expanded to 50 boxes, I believe, I think largely through the redistribution of material. At any rate, it itself, this archive, is similarly bound up with these disputes over the past. The Duterte administration has, through the anti-terrorism task force, through various red tagging agencies raising accusations of communism, in particular, an Orwellian body known as the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or NTF-LCAC, has been removing radical literature from university libraries, purging them. And there is the threat that the Radical Papers, an irreplaceable source of information about the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, even a bit into the 80s, would be in some way censored or removed. We can see here a headline from the Philippine Daily Inquirer on December 5, "Keepers of Radical Papers at UP Main Library vow not to yield a page." I have, as in my capacity as a scholar, intervened and stressed what a valuable collection this is and that it should not be censored. The material housed in the Radical Papers Archive is the diverse body of radical literature that was produced at this time: leaflets, mimeographed manifestos, documents produced by two rival parties, the various front organizations associated with them, right-wing organizations opposed to them, and so on, all of the literature that was circulating, particularly on campuses. And with great prescience, the librarians in the University of the Philippines collected this material and placed it in metal filing cabinets in the basement of the university and stored them there. When Marcos imposed martial law, most radicals, most activists burned their radical literature. It had become an incriminating document. And were it not for the papers housed at the University of the Philippines library, a tremendous loss to history would have occurred. But these were safely stored over the course of martial law. They were subsequently turned into microfilm by Cornell University, and I digitized the microfilm, itemized every item, sorted it chronologically, dated it, and then used this ultimately to construct my account of the events in the Sino-Soviet split and the imposition of martial law. The argument that I'd like to make today is about why there were two communist parties at this time? Why not one? And how did this align with the Sino-Soviet split? And ultimately, I am contending that the Sino-Soviet split was not fundamentally a national dispute between the USSR and China that had collateral damage, blowback throughout the communist world, but rather that the Sino-Soviet dispute was a global dispute in world Stalinism that had a core, the USSR and China, and a periphery that throughout the world, from the Philippines to New Zealand to the United States to France to Indonesia, et cetera, there was, in every country where there was a significant communist party, there was a similar split, a similar conflict. And these, as I'm saying, were not like a collateral damage of something that was going on in the communist bloc, but were part of a global process. And while the core certainly impacted developments in the periphery, so too developments in the periphery shaped the course of the conflict in the core. Now, that's the argument of a book that I'm currently working on, Aligned Rivalries. In this case, I'm going to be dealing with the Philippines specifically as a case study for this. I was inspired in thinking about this by a quote from Brodel in his work Out of Italy, where he writes of the dialectic of the internal and external of the Italian Renaissance, and noted that it is sometimes said that light shed from the margin is the best, that a complex whole may best be apprehended from its outer limits. In a situation in which every fact, every event has been minutely studied by generations of devoted historians, the vantage point of the periphery, of the diaspora, can provide new clarity to developments in the core. So it is this insight, the idea that sometimes the core, in this case, the core, either the Italian Renaissance or the Sino-Soviet dispute, has been minutely studied and dissected, sometimes overstudied, and that we can gain new insight, not simply into the details, but even the periodization of developments from the vantage point of the periphery. What is the existing explanation prior to my intervention for the Sino-Soviet split in the Philippines? Scandalously little, despite the fact that this proved to be a critical development, not only in Philippine radical politics, but in the political history of the country as a whole. My contention is that the communist parties were instrumental in the imposition of dictatorship by Ferdinand Marcos. One party assisted Marcos in imposing dictatorship and entered his cabinet. The other channeled all of the social unrest of the times behind the interests of his ruling class rivals, who were themselves aspiring to dictatorship. If this is the case, then it becomes a critical question to understand the country's history. Why were there two parties? Why did these parties align with the Sino-Soviet dispute? The most significant scholarly explanation prior to my work was that of Francisco Nemenzo, Dodong Nemenzo. Nemenzo himself was a member of the Central Committee of the PKP in the period leading up to martial law, and had a conflict with the PKP over their endorsement of martial law in a spectacular and somewhat bloody fashion. He was suppressed. He wound up becoming a professor at the University of the Philippines and went on to become the president of the University of the Philippines. And in 1984, in an unpublished paper delivered in Australia at the ANU, he put forward an explanation for the Sino-Soviet split in the Philippines. And he argued, the schism was not a local expression of the international dispute between the Soviet and Chinese parties, but the offshoot of a generational rift between the remnants of an aborted rebellion. He's in reference to older veterans of the Hook Rebellion, which I'll touch on in just a moment, and the new elements who were spared the trauma of defeat. Since it occurred at the height of the Sino-Soviet dispute, what was a domestic quarrel assumed an international dimension. Neither the Communist Party of the Soviet Union nor the Communist Party of China were initially involved. Their interventions, which came later, aggravated rather than triggered the conflict. Now, I'm sympathetic to Nemenzo here. The argument that Nemenzo is attempting to make is in opposition to, as almost all scholarship is, a prior argument. And that prior argument was coming from right-wing forces associated with the Marcos dictatorship and anti-communists who asserted effectively that the split was the product of external machination, and that in fact the leaders of the communist parties were agents of foreign powers, that the leaders of the PKP were the agents of Moscow, that the leaders of the CPP were the agents of Beijing. They were the representatives of Mao and Khrushchev in the Philippines, or Brezhnev, etc. This argument is baseless and ultimately was tied to the desire to repress. And Nemenzo, in a liberal reread of this, is saying, no, this was a domestic, it was a national dispute. But despite my sympathy for the motives underpinning this, which I think are salutary, this is not an intellectually satisfying explanation. It falls apart on a number of levels. One, as I will demonstrate in a moment, there were intimate ties between China and the section of the party that broke away prior to the split. Two, the idea here is that there was a generational rift, that the older layers, veterans of the Hook Rebellion, had an opposition to the sort of radical politics of this younger layer. But if we examine the actual outcome of the dispute, we find that there were many older Hook veterans, Angel Baking and others, who allied with the CPP, that is to say the pro-Beijing party. What is more, the majority, in fact, the overwhelming majority of the youth remained with the pro-Moscow party, including Nemenzo himself, who was one of the youth and was a leader of the youth wing of the party. This then is not a satisfying explanation, despite its salutary intent. What is? This is the heart of the argument that I would like to make. The global Sino-Soviet split played out along what I am calling a contradiction at the heart of global Stalinism. And I need to explain what that means. But it wasn't just a contradiction, it was a contradiction in the particular context. And that context was mounting social unrest and a rising tide of global authoritarianism. In this fraught social context, a contradiction at the heart of the political program of international communism, of global Stalinism, led to the Sino-Soviet split. What do I mean by Stalinism? I think there is a common understanding that is not incorrect, that Stalinism is the repressive mechanisms of the bureaucracy associated above all with Joseph Stalin, purges, show trials, the rewriting and revising of history and overhauling it to serve contemporary political interests, etc. These things are all of them expressions of Stalinism, of the rule of both Joseph Stalin and also of Mao Zedong. But I argue that these were the necessary outgrowths of a political program, that they are not the essence of the matter. Stalinism expressed the political interests of privileged layers of the party bureaucracy within the Soviet Union and, after 1949, China. Seeking to defend and expand the social basis of their positions, bureaucrats put forward a nationalist program of building socialism in one country as the paramount political task, rather than world socialist revolution. Looking to secure diplomatic and trade relations in service to the construction of their national economies, Stalinist bureaucrats sought political capital with which to negotiate with the ruling class in countries around the world. To this end, they rehabilitated the old Menshevik line of a two-stage revolution. They instructed communist parties around the globe that the tasks of the revolution in which they were engaged were not yet socialist in character, but national and democratic only. A section of the capitalist class, they argued, would play a progressive role in this necessary first stage. The goal of Communist Party leaders should thus be to secure an alliance with this progressive section of the national bourgeoisie and to bring the pressure and support of a mass movement behind their elite allies. This is the crux of the program of Stalinism. Stalinism was the nationalist interests of the Soviet Union, subsequently of China. Before it was a program for revolution, it was about the national construction of socialism. That was paramount. Therefore, you need political capital to negotiate trade relations, diplomatic ties around the world. What political capital do you have? The communist parties. And you instruct them to ally with a section of the elite, saying that this is the first stage of a two-stage revolution. This then, I've put it in 3 stages here, 3 basic points on my slide are the key points of Stalinism: socialism in one country, the two-stage revolution, and the block of 4 classes. I've selected an image here from a book, a little booklet from the Radical Papers Archive by the Communist Party of the Philippines called Drawing Tulong sa Pagtuturo. It's a text on how to use drawing in political education. And it very schematically, it's quite effective as a manual for instruction, or in my case, a manual for demonstrating the program of Stalinism, shows the enemies and the friends of the revolution. And the mga kaaway, the enemies, are the imperialistang Estados Unidos, that is to say, the imperialist United States with the Uncle Sam top hat, the comprador bourgeoisie, so that is the comprador bourgeoisie you can see is the overweight capitalist up top, and the Panginoong May Lupa, the landlord. But on the bottom, we can see the friends, and that is to say the progressive elements of the revolution. And we see manggagawa, the worker, magsasaka, the farmer, petty burguesia, the petty bourgeoisie, and the pambansang burguesia. And this is the critical point, the national bourgeoisie. And you can see he's not as overweight as the comprador bourgeoisie. The national bourgeoisie is an ally, is a progressive force in this revolution, because it is not a socialist revolution. The first stage of the revolution is a national and democratic one. Flowing from this is the contradiction at the heart of international Stalinism. The appeal of this program, its global strength, rested on its appeal to layers of nationalist intellectuals in countries of belated capitalist development. Many Communist Party leaders outside of the Soviet Union were drawn to Stalinism because they saw this as a means of implementing national reforms. It allowed them to deploy the banner of Marxism and the language of revolution to win mass support for industrialization under native capitalist ownership in opposition to foreign corporations. Loans from and trade with the Soviet bloc were an additional measure in furtherance to this end. The support which the PKP gave to Ferdinand Marcos in 1965, which I'll get to in just a moment, was an expression of this program. So, I mean, this was a paramount consideration for national intellectuals throughout the global South, the so-called Third World, in the 1950s and 60s, that of national industrialization, etc. But these nationalist reforms required mass enthusiasm, and mass enthusiasm for trade measures on behalf of native capitalism, subsidies on behalf of national industry. These were measures in support to the interests of the bosses, to use the language of workers, not in the interests of workers. And the argument thus amounts to something like trickle-down economics. If we carry out measures that further the interests of national capitalists, it will benefit our entire economy, and a rising tide will float all boats. That's not an easy sell to workers in a time of social unrest. But if you can dress that up as Marxist, if you can claim that it is revolutionary, if you can claim that this is the program of the October Revolution, then it becomes much more appealing. This was the function of Stalinism. There was a contradiction, however, at the heart of this program, because it compelled the party to engage in a perilous political balancing act, which in a context of mounting social unrest became increasingly difficult to sustain. By the end of 1966, the PKP's attempt to retain the support of protesters and strikers while preserving an alliance with the ruling class collapsed. This is the essence of the contradiction at the heart of global Stalinism. It was a program that was oriented to alliance with a section of the capitalist class, with a section of the elite. But that alliance was concluded on the basis of a hold over a mass movement. The parties were in many ways the purveyors of this mass movement. They channeled the energy of the mass movement behind the interests of their elite allies. Now, in a time of social stability, that was a balancing act, but it was manageable. But in the time of social unrest, in which the elite are moving increasingly towards authoritarian rule, and the masses are in the streets protesting, workers, peasants, youths, and are being cracked down on by the police, in which there is this social tension pulling apart at the seams. Stalinism, which sought to reconcile these two, was fundamentally torn apart along the lines of this contradiction. And this contradiction was a global contradiction. The social unrest of the Philippines in the 1960s and 70s was an expression of global social unrest, protests over the war in Vietnam, the general strike in France, etc. Now, why was it that this played out separately in the Soviet Union and China? How is that bound up with this global contradiction? The Soviet Union and China were both committed to the construction of socialism within their own borders, and they never merged their economies. Their divergent national interests inevitably conflicted, giving rise to rivalry, then open split and armed conflict. The uneven economic development of the two countries and their starkly different geopolitical circumstances fueled tensions. Situated behind the buffer zone of Eastern Europe and with a fairly stable industrial base, the Soviet Union followed a policy of peaceful coexistence with the United States and established friendly ties with autocrats. China, in contrast, found itself by the mid-1960s threatened on all sides, facing an imminent threat posed by the US invasion of Vietnam and the loss of its largest international ally, the Partido Komunista Indonesia, the PKI, after a military coup in 1965 by General Suharto, which saw hundreds of thousands of party cadre killed. The Chinese Communist Party sought to whip up armed struggle throughout the region to defuse the threat of US imperialism to China's immense imperiled borders. While the Soviet government embraced Suharto, the CCP promoted protracted people's war and armed uprisings throughout the countryside of the world backed by China, the Yan'an of world revolution. So it is at this moment, from effectively 1965 to 1971, that the Sino-Soviet split and global Maoism take its most recognizable form. The Soviet Union is pursuing peaceful coexistence, establishing friendly ties with autocrats, including Suharto, while China is advocating armed struggle throughout the countryside of the world, encircling the cities from the countryside. Now, the program that was being promoted by Mao, the line of Lin Biao, was not in opposition to an alliance with a section of the capitalist class. It was mobilized in service to it. The armed struggle would function effectively as the private army of whomever served as the elite ally of the Communist Party, oriented to the line of Beijing. And on the line of Beijing, all of the vast social unrest of the time could be corralled, could be retained by the radical rhetoric of cultural revolution and armed struggle. Who then were the allies of the line of the party oriented towards Beijing? Well, the answer is that in the period of social unrest, as authoritarianism becomes increasingly a reality, the threat of dictatorship and martial law, there are forces that I have termed the conspiring understudies. That is to say, those who are not opposed to dictatorship in the ruling class, but are nonetheless opposed to the figure who is emerging as dictator. They wish to be dictator themselves. And it is these conspiring understudies, who in the Philippines were largely bound up with old landed money, that became the allies of the CPP, the pro-China party, above all the figure of Benigno Aquino. I'm going to walk through now in a somewhat rapid fashion and outline. If there are questions, I can go back to any of these slides. But I'm going to walk through now concretely how this occurred. I've dwelt at some length on the basic argument about the global Sino-Soviet split, its shape, its motives. How did this play out? The Communist Party of the Philippines at the beginning of the 1960s was one party, not two. And it was known as the PKP, the Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas. And it was largely dormant at the end of the 1950s. The brutal suppression of the Huk Rebellion in the first half of the decade, the emergence of truly reactionary McCarthyism that saw leaders of the Communist Party threatened with the death penalty, led to the party adopting a policy that was effectively a liquidationist policy. The party disappeared from public life. It reemerged on the impetus of the PKI in Indonesia. It was an Indonesian graduate student at the University of the Philippines by the name of Bakri Ilyas, who contacted a young graduate student at the university named Jose Maria Sison, known as Joma Sison. And Sison will go on to become the head of the pro-Beijing party, the CPP, and is still the ideological leader of that party. This impulse brought Sison to Indonesia, where he met with IDIT and other forces. And in December 1962, the PKP was effectively reborn. There was the formation of an executive committee, of which Sison was a member, to run the affairs of the PKP. There was a newly formed labor union organization, the Lapiang Manggagawa, and they directed this party, this labor party, to back the interests of Justado Macapagal, then president of the Philippines. The party, within the space of 6 months, was behind the scenes playing an absolutely critical role in national life. 1965 was a turning point, not only in the Philippines, but throughout Asia and throughout the world. We see the American invasion of Vietnam. We see the crushing of the PKI, the emergence of the Suharto dictatorship. In many ways, the forms of the new period, a period of revolutionary upheaval and dictatorship, emerged here. War and dictatorship, the themes of this period of unrest. And with the crushing of the PKP lost its connections to international communism. The war in Vietnam became the decisive political question for youths in particular, but for broad layers of the population during the election year of 1965. Macapagal was running for re-election. He had, up until 1964, received the backing of the PKP, albeit through front organizations. In 1964, prior to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Lyndon Johnson had reached out to Macapagal and requested that the Philippines prepare to send troops to Vietnam in support of an impending influx of American forces to the country. And Macapagal had pledged that he would be sending Filipino troops. His commitment to send Filipino troops became the decisive question in the 1965 election. And Marcos, who was running against him, postured as an opponent of the deployment of Filipino forces to the American war in Vietnam. He accused Macapagal of attempting to impose dictatorship on the country, words that history would render ironic. But I don't think it's because Marcos was intending to impose dictatorship in 1965. It was the social circumstances that changed, and with it, the complexion of the entire ruling class. And on the basis of Marcos' pledge to keep the Philippines out of Vietnam, the PKP, and Joma Sison in particular, backed Marcos for president. And Sison gave speeches to Kabataan Makabayan, Lapiang Manggagawa, Masaka, the front organizations of youth, workers, and peasants, and instructed them to vote for Ferdinand Marcos in 1965. Shortly after Marcos's election, Marcos told Stanley Karnow of the Washington Post, "Many of us felt that the United States was preparing to withdraw from Vietnam, but now that the United States has demonstrated its resolute will to slug it out, we've been reassured." 2 weeks after being elected president, Marcos was committed to sending troops to Vietnam. Now, let me give you a sense of the intensity of unrest that emerges in this time period from a quote, classified memo from Marshall Wright of the National Security Council to Walt Rostow, National Security Advisor, in August 1967. Wright wrote, "It would be nearly impossible to overestimate the gravity of the problems with which our next ambassador to Manila must deal. It has become commonplace for people knowledgeable on the Philippines to predict a vast social upheaval in the near future. There is widespread talk that the current president, Ferdinand Marcos, will be the last popularly elected Philippine chief executive." That proved true. Many high-level American officials consider the Philippines to be the most serious and the most bleak threat that we face in Asia. It's extraordinary. Now, Marcos was re-elected in 1969, but he was the last popularly elected executive for nearly 2 decades. And this is an extraordinary statement in many ways, but think about the context. The Cultural Revolution is raging in China. America is now immersed in the war in Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of troops deployed there. The PKI has been crushed. Suharto has risen to power in a military dictatorship in Indonesia, but the Philippines is perhaps the most serious and most bleak threat that US interests face in Asia. That was the level of social unrest that Washington was tracing in the region. It was this social unrest that tore the party apart. How did that occur? With Marcos's declaration in early 1966 in the Philippine media that he would be deploying Filipino troops to Vietnam, there was an impulse among all of the youth in particular to protest, as their counterparts around the globe were protesting. They were restrained by the party's youth wing, the Kabataang Makabayan, which did not want to protest against the Marcos administration. Many of the representatives of the PKP had now entered into the cabinet of Ferdinand Marcos. The youth were straining to protest. They were being held back by the party. It is in this context that Sison traveled to China secretly in July, August 1966. This is an extraordinary moment, not simply for the Philippines, but for the global Sino-Soviet dispute. In late July 1966, there was the 12th Jinsuikyo World Congress against atomic and hydrogen bombs held in Hiroshima. Japan had recently, the Japanese Communist Party, had recently reoriented its political ties away from the Chinese Communist Party towards the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The impetus for the reorientation was that the crushing of the PKI, which they held the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, responsible for. The Chinese Communist Party had recently issued instructions to the Japanese Communist Party to take up armed struggle. The Japanese Communist Party had refused. They saw in the terrible events of Indonesia confirmation that the Chinese Communist Party was adventurist, reoriented to the Soviet Union. They prevented Chinese delegates from attending this conference on atomic and hydrogen bombs. And a number of delegates, including Joma Sison, from countries around the world, walked out of the Hiroshima conference and then secretly traveled to Beijing. They arrived in Beijing in early August 1966. The day after their arrival, Mao issued his "Bombard the Headquarters" poster and launched the Cultural Revolution. The Red Guard marched through the streets of Beijing in front of the eyes of all of the visiting delegates who would subsequently become the founders of the various parties oriented to the line of Beijing. They saw the line of Beijing representing the unleashing of the radical energy of youth. The unleashing of the radical energy of youth in the Philippines took place on October 24, 1966. Johnson visited the Philippines for the staging of the Manila Summit, which was intended to present the war in Vietnam as being popularly supported by democratic parties, democratic powers throughout Asia. There was a protest outside of the summit, staged by youth under the leadership and instigation of Sison. They were cracked down on and brutally suppressed by Philippine police. And it was this moment that was sort of a watershed in the unleashing of youth activism and workers' struggles throughout the country. The social unrest bubbled to the surface. The response of Sison to what became a movement against police brutality in late 1966 was an attempt to corral it. He gave a speech in which he said that the fundamental problem of police brutality was that the police had been miseducated in anti-nationalism, and that what was necessary were campaigns of what he called sympathy, in which youth would go to the police and educate them in nationalism so that they would learn their true interests. The police were not, in the Marxist conception, the agents of the state responsible for carrying out the interests of the ruling class by cracking down on workers and peasants. These were not bodies of armed men. They were miseducated and could be won over to the interests of the nation. Sison sought to restrain the youth, to hold them back with the language of nationalism. This restraining, however, there was an objective logic to the contradiction, to the social unrest. And it led to an outburst of red tagging accusations, of anti-communist accusations in the legislature. And Joma Sison, you can see him here from the front page of the Manila Chronicle, faced prosecution. It was those elements drawn to the radical line of China that were being targeted by the state, not those tied to the line of the Soviet Union. And in fact, the central figure in this red tagging, Carmelo Barbero, you can see him here in the black suit, while he was an anti-communist reactionary who became the Undersecretary of Defense of the military dictatorship of Marcos in 1972. was himself closely tied to Moscow. His daughter studied at Patrice Lumumba University, and visiting Soviet scholars would stay in his home. The youths were seeking to travel to China, had been invited to travel to China. Marcos had approved their travel to China, but in the wake of the social unrest unleashed by October 24, Marcos declared that no one, professors, students, no one would be allowed to visit China. While ties to China were being prevented, while it was now forbidden to go there, the Marcos government, through the Communist Party, leadership oriented to the Soviet Union, was conducting informal diplomacy with Moscow. We can see here the figure of Teodosio Lanzang, a Communist Party member who had been exiled in Moscow for years. In January 1967, the Marcos administration quietly arranged for him to return to the Philippines, and working with other leaders of the PKP, in exile, William and Celia Pomeroy, or in the Philippines, Ruben Torres, who was on the staff of Juan Ponce Enrile, who was a critical member of the Marcos administration. They orchestrated informal diplomacy with Moscow and the Eastern European bloc to arrange the sale of Philippine sugar and diplomatic ties. All of this came to a head with the formation of the Movement for the Advancement of Nationalism. The Movement for the Advancement of Nationalism was the culmination of half a decade of effort by the PKP to form an alliance with the national bourgeoisie. This organization brought together the representatives of the PKP, members of the Central Committee, members of the future Central Committee of the CPP, senators and congressmen, as well as the various businessmen, banking interests, heads of pawn shops, etc., in a common alliance. This was formed in March 1967. February to March. It was in the scramble for the ties with these sections of the national bourgeoisie that the party fell apart, and the wing associated with Sison, a number of people around him, were expelled from the party in April to May of 1967. They published a statement in the Peking Review on June 9, issued on May 1, that stated, committed to an uncompromising struggle against modern revisionism, with the Soviet revisionist ruling clique at its center. Briefly, this played out in two ways. The forces associated with Sison founded a new party in late December, early January 1968-1969 that declared that it was armed with invincible Mao Zedong thought. The Communist Party of the Philippines will surely triumph, and the Filipino people and the leadership of the revolutionary proletariat will achieve people's democracy first and socialism next. Two-stage revolution. You can see the masses reaching for the gun from which political power flows. The critical element in the founding of the Communist Party wasn't the line of Mao Zedong. Sison had that in May of 1967. The struggle over the course of a year and a half, nor was it to make recruits. There were only 12 founding members to the party. The fundamental question was to find a section of the capitalist class with whom they could ally. Sison sought to retain ties with Marcos. This failed. But in 1968, he established ties with the restive sections of the capitalist class, looking to use the energy of the times, the social unrest, behind their political interests, and above all, Ninoy Aquino, who facilitated the founding of the CPP and its alliance with what became the New People's Army, the NPA. Marcos, meanwhile, established an alliance with the PKP. The PKP carried out a bombing campaign in collaboration with the military that justified Marcos' declaration of martial law in September 1972. Martial law was ultimately about repression. It was not about perpetuating Marcos in power. That was secondary. It was not about the theft of wealth. That was secondary. The reason everyone was engaged in a scramble for dictatorship was the need to suppress the immense unrest of the times. Marcos arrested 60,000 people for political reasons. These were not the bourgeois opposition, nor members of the Communist Party. In their overwhelming majority, these were workers and peasants and youths. That's the first 5 years of the Marcos dictatorship. The PKP carried out an internal purge of anyone opposed to their measures, and then endorsed the military dictatorship and entered the Marcos cabinet. Mao, meanwhile, opened ties with Marcos. This is the final slide. The line of China, of protracted People's War and so on, had escalated tensions with the Soviet Union so sharply that there was now an open armed conflict between the Soviet Union and China. Alarmed, Mao sought a geopolitical ally in Washington, conducted ping-pong diplomacy, met with Kissinger and Nixon, and with the opening of these relations, opened ties with autocrats around the globe. When Marcos declared martial law, Mao Zedong was interested in establishing relations. Here we see Imelda Marcos traveling to China in September 1974, and Mao meeting with her. The CPP, founded along the line of Lin Biao and Mao Zedong in 1968, hailed Imelda Marcos's visit to China as a diplomatic victory for the People's Republic of China and a victory for the Philippine revolutionary struggle. Marcos announced that he would be cracking down on dissidents in the Philippines. Mao Zedong said nothing. The Chinese Communist Party said nothing. They would not interfere in the internal affairs of the Philippines. The Philippine Communist Party, like many communist parties around the globe, set in motion by the political line of Mao from 1965 to 1970, was now unmoored from the Yan'an of world revolution, disavowed. But it was this political line that continues to be its orientation to this day. It was defined by the stamp of this time period. So to conclude, to draw the sort of the big picture questions from this history that I've ran through and the contradiction that I've outlined. One, the Sino-Soviet dispute was a global phenomenon. It was bound up with social upheaval and the contradiction of the heart of Stalinism, and associated with the rising tide of authoritarianism. Two, and this I was unable to deal with as much as I would like. It's the subject of the book that I'm working on. It was disseminated not through a hub and spokes model in which Moscow reaches out to countries and Beijing reaches out to countries, but through a web of connected ties. Think here of the relations established with Indonesia, of the fact that these relations were mediated through Hiroshima, etc. This was diffused through a complex network throughout the world, throughout the global South in particular. And three, studying the Sino-Soviet split in this way allows us to see past the binary of the Cold War. It's extraordinary. Marcos was a critical ally of Washington. An element that I've kind of had to just breeze over was the role of US imperialism in all of this, which is a critical consideration in Philippine politics. Marcos was a key ally of the United States. The United States assisted him in his martial law regime. They drafted his land reform program that the PKP heralded as the continuation of the unfinished revolution. And yet, Marcos was in an intimate alliance with the Communist Party and was seeking ties with the Soviet Union. And examining the Sino-Soviet split in this way allows us to see past the binary of the Cold War that divides the world up into camps of interest. And it is suggestive of the fact that a more constructive way of interpreting this history is not to follow the map of geopolitics, but the map of the class struggle. For that, in the end, was decisive. It was that that gave rise to the Sino-Soviet split and was shaped by it. Thank you.
Many thanks, Joseph, for a really interesting and very rich and yet very clear and coherent analysis. Let's open up for some questions. If you have a question, please put it in a signal in the chat, either that you'd like to speak or articulate your question. So we have one here from Matthew Wolgar. Matt, would you like to pose it yourself? You want to speak up, or shall I just read out your question?
Okay, I'll give it a try. Yes, I just wanted to ask if you could expand a bit more on the historiographical dimension and explain how your work either agrees with or revises other recent interpretations, and I'm thinking particularly of Jeremy Friedman's work.
Yeah, I can't do that justice for the purposes of the audience to expand upon Friedman's work or the larger scholarship of the Sino-Soviet split. But ultimately, the difference is that mine is a very bottom-up approach. And I believe that Friedman's approach is a somewhat global top-down approach. They're complementary and useful. in sort of a synthesis. But ultimately, I'm attempting to explain from the vantage point of the membership of the party, from the vantage point, as it were, of the streets, of the factories, etc., why there was an intrinsic logic to the Sino-Soviet split that was not imposed upon workers and youth, but at the same time was not simply a misunderstood domestic dispute. To find a marriage of these two things that is organic to Philippine social life. And I would argue, although I haven't demonstrated that in this talk, social life more generally, bound up with this social conflict. And I think that's the distinction, as opposed to an implementation of the Sino-Soviet dispute, sort of a struggle for the third world, which is also true, it was. And so I think these are complementary rather than exclusive approaches, but it's bound up with my orientation to these layers in my sources, as well as in my sympathies. And I think that's the fundamental distinction.
Let me abuse my privilege or at least access to key buttons as chair to pose a question in the absence of an immediate other question in the chat. And that is as follows. You attribute significance to the bipolar nature of world communism during this period.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, though, within the Philippine context, whether the bifactional nature of Philippine politics during a period when Philippine politics is very straightforwardly two-party, whether that also has real significance. When you said, for example, that there's a need to ally with a segment of the capitalist class, it seems to me it might be less than straightforward or convincing to describe that segment of the capitalist class in sort of class terms, class segment terms, and instead there's a more bifactional nature to elites, oligarchical ruling class politics in the Philippines. And so if we think comparatively and note that whether it's the PKI in the early period that's dealing with both the PRC and the USSR, or other parties, and then we think in a post-Cold War fashion to the continued divisions and sort of at least bifactional nature of the Philippine left today, might there be ways in which the embeddedness of left-wing politics within a form of oligarchical democracy that has this kind of factional quality rather than programmatic, left-wing, right-wing parties in a parliamentary system, that plays a role in sort of making the bifactional, PKP versus CPP struggle so lively and important and protracted?
This is a really good comment / question, one that I am actually working through. There is certainly in this period, strikingly, a bifactional character to the Philippine elite. And yet, and here's my response, there was a class character. It was not simply rival sections of the oligarchy. This was noted by Pete Lacaba, Jose Lacaba, a very famous Philippine journalist and author, during this time period, writing in 1971 about the nature of this sort of bifactional elite. And he said, if one were to give this a class character, it would be the struggle between the ancien, the older layers, and the nouveau in Philippine society. And he saw, and I think he's right, the ancien, the older layers, landed capital and so on, tied to old colonial landed interests that had invested in industry and so on, represented by the forces in opposition to Marcos. We see names like Osmeña, Lopez, Aquino, all of them coming forward with this sort of nature. And the forces that were gathered around Marcos, and Marcos himself, were this sort of the nouveau riche. And they were forces to be honest, that were more on the make. And to an extent, for the Marcoses at any rate, the apparatus of politics was the means of aggrandizement and of accumulation. And Marcos himself was the quintessence of the Nouveau. Marcos was a man who believed in self-construction in every aspect. And if he couldn't do it himself, and he did a lot himself, he was an extraordinary person, he would lie about it. So extraordinary achievement compounded with extraordinary lies. He received the Medal of Honor, he claimed, and so on and so forth. Many of our audience are familiar with these lies. And it was this layer, the nouveau riche, largely scorned by the ancien, that clustered around Marcos. Now, of course, you're going to find exceptions to this, but I think that this analysis holds up. There is a class character to this. And it was the forces of the nouveau, invested above all with national industry and so on, that wound up supported by the PKP, and the forces of the ancien, tied to old landed estates and so on, that wound up associated with the CPP. To carry your question forward into the present, it isn't so much a bifactional landscape any longer, although there are pressures for that to reemerge. There are various rival factions of the elite, oligarchic dynasties and representatives of oligarchic dynasties, and it presents a very complex landscape for the left to navigate. And by left, I do in fact mean various forms of this politics of Stalinism. In one form or another, an attempt to form an alliance with these parties rather than an independent party of the working class. This played out just last week, in which all of the forces of the Makabayan coalition, representing trade unions, representing youth, representing women, all of these sectoral organizations, bound to the line of national democracy, which I've outlined, announced their endorsement for Leni Robredo, despite the fact that Leni Robredo refuses to include them on her slate. And this is bound up with complex questions, the question of the military, the question of a rival faction of the left known as Akbayan. But in the end, there wasn't an orientation in Makabayan to forming an independent party, precisely because there is a continuity of this political program. The question for them was if they would orient to Pacquiao or to a number of other possible forces on the landscape, because it is no longer, as you said, a bifactional landscape. But in the end, they put their money down on Robredo. So these things are still at play. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it's an engagement with your question at any rate.
Great. Very interesting, insightful answer. Any other questions from the audience? Please put your name in the chat or pipe up now. So Xuan, would you like to speak?
Hi, Prof. Seidel. Hi, Joseph. It's good to see you again. Hope you're both doing well. So I'm afraid my internet connection may not be great. If you can't hear me, I'm going to have to trouble Prof. Seidel to read out my question on my behalf. My question is really about the ideological contortions of the PKP in relation to Stalinism. There was an excellent talk. I think you were very detailed about this, but I still, there's a connection that I can't seem to make in my mind, right? How did the PKP justify its support for Marcos to the extent of functioning as agents provocateurs or, supporting the AFP deployment in Vietnam? Because this goes so much further than, say, for example, the comparative example that you raised, the PKI and the PKI support for the cultivation of an indigenous bourgeoisie in Indonesia. Or perhaps, and you did seem to hint at this at the beginning of your talk, one could simply argue that Stalinism is a kind of pragmatism, unlinked to ideology. So I'd love to hear you expound a little more on these contortions if you can. Thank you.
Thanks for a terrific question. I could go on at great length in answer to this. So I will struggle to present as succinct an answer as possible. There's multiple facets to it. How do you justify carrying out the role of agent provocateur in furtherance to the imposition of military dictatorship? Well, here there's an interesting connection to Cuba, actually, and to Latin America. There was a layer of the PKP bound up with its youth wing, one of its youth wings, its underground youth wing known as the Young Communist League, that was reading Regis Debray on the Cuban Revolution, revolution within the revolution, and was reading Carlos Marighella, the Brazilian Stalinist who advocated urban bombings. And it's a complex question, but ultimately, Debré in his work attempted to depict Castro's pragmatism, which did not originate with communism, but originated with the bourgeois nationalism of Castro, to depict the pragmatic guerrilla tactics of Castroism as the way forward for the formation of international communist parties. And it was ultimately about abandoning politics in favor of armed conflict, and armed conflict would lead to the creation of focos, and focos would become the basis for the revolution ultimately. But it was, to its core, a pragmatic approach. And there were layers within the YCL, the Young Communist League of the PKP, who were drawn to this sort of armed struggle and so on, but not armed struggle in the countryside, but armed struggle in the city. Here, Marighella, the Brazilian Stalinist, was particularly influential because it was this that justified bombings in the city. And the function of these bombings was not their political role in educating the working class or something like that, not a bit, but in the construction of focos. And it was this justification that allowed them to turn a blind eye to their alliance with the military, the fact that they were collaborating with the military in these bombings. And it was many of the young people responsible for this, tragically, many of those associated with this bombing campaign, promoting it in their papers, etc., that when martial law was declared, opposed martial law. They had carried out the provocations that had made it possible in the name of sort of pragmatic FOCO formation. And then they opposed the PKP's endorsement of martial law. There was a bloody war within the PKP in late 1972, early 73, in which 70 to 80, perhaps more, communists were murdered, some of them shot in their beds. It is safe to say that in the early stages of martial law, more communists were killed by the PKP than were killed by the Marcos dictatorship, which is a truly staggering thing. So that's the first element. This role of agent provocateurs had an ideological justification. Second, how do you officially endorse military dictatorship? The initial stages of endorsement came from William Pomeroy, who was in England, and he wrote a statement in which he declared that yes, Marcos was imposing crackdown and so on, but ultimately he was targeting the Maoists. So there was this early stage where it was like, it's against our enemies. But it needed a stronger justification than that. And it was in a Congress of the PKP in 1973, where they drafted the official justification for endorsing martial law. And in a protracted and contorted argument, argued that Marcos was being progressive. Ultimately, the argument was based on a new political line coming from Moscow, which was known as the non-capitalist road to socialism. And the argument was that autocrats could be pressured through an alliance with the Soviet Union to carry out the necessary measures of building socialism. How does Marcos achieve this? Here's the argument in a nutshell, and I'll just sort of sum it up. Basically, US imperialism is in crisis, the Vietnam War, etc. The declining share of the US hold over the economy is a real concern, and thus the Nixon doctrine sort of spreading rule throughout, no longer directly ruled by the United States. In this context, figures like Marcos had to develop capitalism. And remember, the development of capitalism is something the Communist Party wants. This is the first stage of a two-stage revolution. The barrier to the establishment of capitalism, argued the PKP, was the oligarchs, the Enchants, who were allied to the CPP. And Marcos would use martial law to accelerate the process of creating capitalism in the Philippines by suppressing the oligarchs. They said, this is a quote from their Congress documents, that what would take a century, the building of capitalism in the Philippines, can be reduced to 5 years through the mechanisms of martial law. The Congress documents called the mechanisms of martial law fascist. It asserted that the mechanisms of martial law were being instigated by the IMF and US imperialism. At the same time, they said it was building capitalism, and this was a progressive outcome and should thus be supported. Fascism was carried out the progressive achievement of capitalism. It's hard to imagine the lies that this is dressed up as Marxism. But this was the argument, and on the basis of this argument, they entered the martial law cabinet.
Many thanks, Joseph, for a brilliant talk and a really great engagement with some interesting questions from the audience. Unfortunately, our time is drawing to a close. So I'd like to thank you again and thank everyone for attending. To repeat that there should be a recording of this up on our website soon, but also to urge you all to check in back with the Southeast Asia Center at the LSE for events coming up, including next week, the book talk about the China's Belt and Road Initiative, the impact on subregional Southeast Asia, next Wednesday, February 9th. And the following Wednesday, February 16th, the talk about the 1957 flu pandemic in Singapore and decolonization. Many thanks, Joseph, and many thanks to you all.
Thank you, John.
Have a
Thanks,
good rest of
everyone.
your day. Bye-bye.